All right, you're here. Good. Let's actually talk about it. You know that moment in a really cold pool when you jump in and every muscle in your body instantly contracts and your brain screams at you that this was a catastrophic decision? That's your body giving you a polite warning. History's worst punishments skip the warning entirely. People across ancient civilizations had what can only be described as a passion project when it came to making consequences as awful as possible. They put real thought into it, real effort. What they came up with will genuinely ruin your afternoon. Okay, so here is how this goes. Every civilization that has ever existed at some point had to figure out what to do with the people who were ruining things for everyone else. That is a reasonable problem. That is an understandable institutional challenge. The solutions these civilizations came up with are the part of the conversation that tends to get quietly glossed over in school, because there is really no polite way to put most of this on a projector slide and ask a room full of teenagers to take notes on it. Across every era, on every continent, the answer to the question of what to do with the worst people in a given society trended in one remarkably consistent direction. Not rehabilitation, not community service, not a strongly worded letter and a modest fine. Something considerably worse, delivered with what can only be described as genuine institutional enthusiasm. And the more organized the civilization, the more organized that enthusiasm became. Medieval Europe is a reasonable place to start. Not because it had a monopoly on cruelty. History has a full roster of competitors for that particular distinction, but because it was especially methodical. Specifically about the question of how to extract information from someone who had decided they were done cooperating. Enter a man named Gilles de Rais. You might recognize that name from the more respectable side of his biography. Decorated French military commander, celebrated war hero, fought alongside Joan of Arc during the 100 Years' War. Legitimately impressive credentials. He was respected. He had a good public reputation. What the historical record mentions a little more carefully is that after the war wound down, Gilles went through what could generously be described as a difficult period, which eventually resulted in a tribunal in 1440 and a list of charges extensive enough to fill several pages. He was not walking out of that proceeding as a free man, but Gilles is not really the subject here. He is the backdrop, the context, the world we are operating in, because in exactly his era, in exactly his Europe, one of the more inventive interrogation approaches in recorded history was already running as standard practice. It was called rat torture. The name contains everything you need to know. There is no gentler way to introduce it. Spending more time sitting with it does not make the concept more comfortable. Here is how it actually worked. The interrogator would restrain the prisoner and press a metal container, a bucket, a pot, whatever happened to be accessible, firmly against the prisoner's midsection. The container was loaded with several live rats, then heat was applied to the exterior of the metal. Now, here is a quick science lesson for you today. Science lesson. Rats, like essentially every living thing on this planet, have a strong personal preference for not being cooked. When the outside of that container starts climbing in temperature, the rats inside begin to panic. Panicking rats need an exit. Every surface of the bucket is sealed except the one pressed directly against the prisoner's body. So the rats do the only logical thing available to them. They start chewing. Through whatever is in the way. Through whatever gets them to somewhere that is not currently getting hotter by the second. Rats have been documented chewing through materials considerably harder than human tissue when motivated enough. Once they start, they do not stop. The motivation in this particular scenario was, by all accounts, considerable. From a strictly physiological standpoint, unplanned access to the abdominal cavity does not go well for the person on the receiving end. The damage moves fast. Shock follows. Blood loss handles the rest of the arithmetic at its own efficient pace. The good news, and there is technically a narrow sliver of good news available, is that most people lost consciousness well before things reached their logical conclusion. The bad news is what the logical conclusion involves. It moves very quickly. That part if you are looking for any mercy in this situation at all, is probably it. Here is the detail that somehow makes the whole thing worse. Rat torture was primarily an interrogation technique, not an execution method. The objective was information, not death, and by most accounts, it worked. Reliably. Most prisoners reportedly broke before the heat even fully reached the rats. The bucket and the animals alone was typically sufficient. Someone at some point sat down and developed this as a communication strategy, and the uncomfortable truth is that they were correct, and holding that thought for any length of time does something quite unpleasant to your afternoon. So that was medieval Europe, doing what medieval Europe did: methodical, specific, entirely committed to its own internal logic. But Europe was not the only place where history was moving at this pace, and history, as it reliably does, was happening simultaneously in multiple locations at once. At roughly the same time that Western European interrogators were refining their bucket-based procedures, a man several hundred miles to the southeast was assembling a personal philosophy about punishment that the entire surrounding region was eventually going to hear about whether it wanted to or not. Vlad III, Duke of Wallachia, a principality in what is now Romania, appears in nearly every historical source under a different name: Vlad the Impaler. The title is not ironic, and it is not an exaggeration. He ruled in the mid-15th century with a level of enforcement consistency that made his neighboring rulers look like they were operating a suggestion box. Vlad did not invent impalement. The practice predates him by centuries. What Vlad did was bring a kind of dedicated personal attention to it that distinguished him from essentially everyone who came before. He used it constantly. He used it at a scale that genuinely startled people who were not themselves considered gentle. His enemies ended up on stakes. His prisoners ended up on stakes. People convicted of relatively minor crimes ended up on stakes. Contemporary accounts record him dining outdoors in full view of his judicial work and finding the atmosphere perfectly acceptable. Historians place the numbers associated with his preferred method somewhere between the tens of thousands on the conservative end and considerably higher in less cautious estimates. Even the low number is the kind of figure that makes a reasonable person put down whatever they are currently holding. Now, impalement as Vlad practiced it followed a specific internal logic that took a moment to register when you first heard it described out loud. Most people's instinct, on hearing the word, is to construct a version of the process that moves fast. That instinct is understandable, but incorrect. Speed was not the objective. Duration was the objective. The stake used was typically thick and blunted, smoothed at the tip rather than sharpened to a fine point. And here is a quick science lesson since we are already here. Science lesson. A properly sharpened point causes immediate catastrophic internal damage and accelerates death substantially. A blunted, rounded tip does something the body is considerably less prepared to handle. It displaces tissue rather than cutting through it. It navigates around organs rather than severing them outright. This distinction matters enormously to how long the entire experience lasts. Medical historians with professionally unfortunate research obligations have estimated that optimal impalement conditions could leave a person technically conscious for several hours after the procedure began. Some accounts go further. A few go considerably further than that. The stake was driven into the ground at an upward angle, and the victim was positioned on it from below, left to descend gradually under their own body weight. Gravity did all of the subsequent procedural work. Slowly. There was no intervention after the initial placement. The process was entirely self-resolving, in the worst possible sense of that phrase. Vlad understood the mechanics well enough to vary the width and the angle and the height based on exactly the kind of sentence he wanted to communicate. A quick death was one option. Extended display was another. He treated them as separate tools in the same kit, appropriate to different occasions and different messages. Reports indicate he sometimes held outdoor meals in full view of his work, which is a detail about a person's general disposition that tends to land differently the longer you sit with it. Ottoman soldiers advancing through Wallachian territory during various military campaigns encountered his work along the roads approaching his domain and left written records describing landscapes of staked figures stretching across the hillsides as far as a person could see in the available light. Those accounts were written as warnings to other people considering a similar approach. The warnings worked. Even experienced military commanders reportedly turned their armies around. There is a version of this story that pop culture keeps trying to smooth out and render safely cinematic. Films give you a quick implication and cut away to something else. The administrative records from Vlad's own rule do not cut away. They document a man who understood impalement as governance, as communication, as long-term behavioral management of a population that needed to be persuaded to cooperate. The uncomfortable part, the part that genuinely does not go away if you look at it for more than a few seconds, is that the historical record suggests the approach achieved exactly what Vlad intended it to achieve. Nobody stole twice in Vlad's Wallachia. There is a dark, efficient logic buried in there that is worth acknowledging for exactly one sentence and then moving away from quickly. Moving on. Okay, so here's where things get worse. Given everything documented so far, medieval rat-based interrogation, Vlad's extensive administrative landscape project, a reasonable person might assume we have arrived at the outer boundary of what organized human ingenuity has produced in this particular department. We have not arrived there. The ancient Greeks would like a word. The word involves brass and fire, and a craftsman named Perilos of Athens who holds the very specific historical distinction of having invented something terrible, presenting it proudly to a tyrant, and then being placed inside his own invention as its inaugural operational demonstration. This was the Brazen Bull, a hollow brass statue cast in the form of a bull, large enough to contain an adult human being inside its body cavity, sealed from the outside, fire built underneath. You can already see the general direction this is heading without further assistance. But the element that separates the Brazen Bull from being merely a terrible thing and elevates it to a specifically, deliberately, painstakingly engineered terrible thing, the detail that makes people put their phones down for a moment when they hear it, is what Perilos built into the head. A system of internal tubes and acoustic chambers running through the neck of the statue. When the person inside began to scream, which happened by all accounts, almost immediately, those tubes processed the sound and converted it into something that, to anyone standing outside, resembled the natural bellowing of a bull. Perilos designed this as a feature. He pitched it as a feature. He was proud of it. This is important context for what happened next. Phalaris, tyrant of Acragas in Sicily, circa 560 BC, listened to the full presentation. He let Perilos finish. He acknowledged the craftsmanship. Then, he had Perilos placed inside it to confirm that the acoustic system performed as described. It performed exactly as described. Ancient sources note that Perilos was removed before dying. Whether out of mercy or simply to preserve the device for actual use is not entirely clear from the record, and was subsequently thrown off a cliff at a separate location. This is the historical detail that makes the whole sequence feel almost too specifically constructed to be real. Multiple independent ancient sources corroborate the basic outline. It is entirely real. Brass conducts heat with remarkable efficiency. Full thickness burns across the entire body surface arrive within minutes of the internal temperature reaching intensity. The body's thermal regulation system, which is normally quite good at its job, exhausts its viable options rapidly when the ambient temperature inside a sealed brass chamber climbs past the point of any recovery. Every cooling response your body attempts produces steam. Your own biology accelerates the damage. The good news, and there is essentially none available in this scenario, is that heat-induced shock typically induces unconsciousness before the absolute worst of it arrives. Typically anyway. Phalaris used the device regularly after Perilos' demonstration. He had, according to ancient records, one documented complaint about the design as delivered. He felt the screaming was too quiet. He wanted more acoustic volume from the tube system. He formally requested design improvements. Piraeus was not available to consult on revisions by that point. All right, the Dutch. You probably think of the Dutch and land us somewhere around windmills, tulips, maybe a cheese that comes in a red wax shell. That is the version of Dutch culture that survived into contemporary consciousness because it is the version that transfers well to gift shops and travel brochures. The other version, the Dutch is a naval empire in the 17th century, operating one of the most powerful merchant fleets on the planet, extracting enormous wealth from trade routes that spanned multiple continents. That version had a different internal culture, a significantly more specific one when it came to the question of what to do with sailors who stepped out of line aboard a vessel several thousand miles from the nearest courtroom. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the largest trading corporation in human history at its peak. It had its own army, its own judicial system, its own formally documented methods of punishment, several of which were applied at sea where no external authority existed to object. The one that concerns us is keel hauling. Not the casual metaphorical version of the word that occasionally shows up in the phrase, "I got absolutely keel hauled in that meeting." The actual one, the procedural, nautical, deeply unpleasant one. Here is how it worked. The sailor being sentenced was tied to a rope. That rope was looped under the hull of the ship, under the keel, the solid structural spine running the full length of the vessel along its bottom. On command, the crew on the other side pulled. The sailor went into the water on one side of the ship and was dragged at speed through the water beneath it, emerging on the opposite side. Quick version, you might think? Over in a moment. Uncomfortable, but survivable. Here's a quick science lesson since we are in the middle of this. Science lesson. The hull of a wooden sailing vessel does not stay clean in open ocean conditions. Over time, and not very much time, the exterior becomes thoroughly colonized by barnacles. Barnacles are small marine organisms with calcium carbonate shells. If you have ever handled one, you know that the edge of a barnacle shell is not something you would want to run your hand across casually. Now picture a sailor being dragged the full length of a ship's hull at speed. Every barnacle along that surface registers as a separate high-velocity contact across whatever portion of skin, and the word skin is doing a lot of work here, covering a lot of territory, is currently in contact with the hull, the entire surface area of a person's body, all at once, the full length of the ship. The documentation from VOC disciplinary proceedings, which is a sentence you genuinely did not expect to read today, records keel hauling as a punishment for serious offenses: theft, assault, insubordination at scale. First offense sometimes earned a single pass. Repeat or severe offense earned multiple passes. Each pass involved a complete transit. There are records of sailors surviving one pass and not making it through the second one. There are records of sailors not making it through the first one. The variables were the speed of the pull, the condition of the hull, and whether the sailor's lungs cleared the final waterline before he ran out of air during the transit. That last part is the one that the Dutch Maritime Disciplinary Board apparently left largely to chance and individual lung capacity, which says something quite specific about institutional priorities at the time. The VOC documented over 400 keel hauling sentences in the 17th century alone. They kept records, organized records, with outcomes noted in the margins. Hey, if any of this has somehow reached the part of your brain that finds human history genuinely interesting rather than just disturbing, go ahead and subscribe. There is a lot more where this came from, and the rest of it does not get any less instructive. Now, the specific detail in the keel hauling record that tends to land hardest when people hear it for the first time is not the barnacles. It is not the drowning risk. It is a VOC document from 1651 referencing a sailor named Wouter Loos, convicted of theft at sea, sentenced to 3 consecutive passes under a vessel called the Vergulde Draak. The document records the first pass and the second pass with administrative neutrality in the margins. The third pass does not have a completion note. It has a single word in Dutch that translates loosely and without drama to concluded. That is the whole record. One word in the margin, concluded. Someone wrote that down with a quill and moved on to the next item on the agenda without breaking stride. Loose does not appear in any subsequent document. The Vergoldedraak continued operating on its scheduled route. People in previous centuries were, and there is really only one way to put this, built significantly different from what we are currently working with. They processed things differently. They documented things differently. They filed things. They wrote one word in the margin and went to lunch. The historical record is full of this energy, and it is somehow more disturbing than any individual detail within it. That is where we are leaving this one. If your afternoon needed any of that information, now it has it. If you are looking for more content in this approximate neighborhood of human experience, there is a video on brutal torture methods linked somewhere nearby that picks up roughly where this one finishes and keeps going for a while in the same direction. I will see you over there. People were something else back then. They really, genuinely were.